Good evening, fellow Unselects. Whether you're a seasoned public official, a curious student, or a concerned neighbor, this is the show for you. We are not the elite. We are not the chosen. We are not the elected. We are the Unselects, the ones who ask questions, the ones who challenge the norms, and the ones who refuse to be mere spectators. We're not here to judge. We're here to understand, to ask questions, and possibly have a little fun along the way. I'm Gregg Richards.
And I'm Brian Costello, and we are the Unselects. Good evening, fellow Unselects. On tonight's episode, we're going to ask three questions. The first is, can Shrewsbury Public Schools add students at no additional cost? Second, we're going to ask, how can we hold town meeting members accountable? And finally, how can we towns push back against state mandates? Tonight's episode, unlike the last episode, we're going to go through certain warrants that were presented at the town meeting a few weeks ago. As you remember earlier, we talked about the process, and tonight we're going to specifically talk about those town meeting members and the warrants that we went through. And we're going to start with the primary town budget.
Yeah, the biggest budget of all. So one of the key parts that we want to focus on the budget is the school piece, right? The school is a majority of the budget, $86+ million. Mm-hmm. Huge contribution, right? And the thing that we want to just talk about here, and the reason why we're talking about it is we brought it up, I think, starting back when we were talking about the MBTA, Article 44, and it's when we add students in Shrewsbury, what is truly the cost to Shrewsbury Public Schools, right? And we've made a lot of our arguments, and we're going to look at that again. But the first clip we want to go show is that Select Board member Teresa Flynn brought up specifically, I think, because of some of our efforts, because it wasn't really related when she made the comment. It was kind of out of the blue. She asked Chris Girardi and Joe Sawyer, hey, by the way, we've heard a lot of talk about what it costs to add incremental, or what the incremental cost to add students is. Can you talk a little bit about that? So let's go look at that clip now.
I don't want to kick the hornet's nest, but there is a lot of talk about per pupil cost, especially as we talk about potential growth in Shrewsbury. And I was hoping you could clarify for all of us, specifically when we look at adding students to the system, are we applying that average per pupil cost to each incremental student? And if not, how should we be looking at the incremental cost?
When we look at per pupil cost, we think of it as how many seats we can fit on the airplane. So if we're looking at the per pupil cost of just over $17,000 per student, if we receive 15 students from, say, a new housing complex, those numbers can add up pretty quickly. But as we see over at off of Route 20, there's a complex there. We're receiving 15 students that are spread across all of the schools. We're able to absorb them at no cost. So the numbers would have to stack up pretty significantly at a specific school, at a specific grade level, to where it would need to incur additional teachers, additional transportation or buses for that community.
So the interesting thing I found is that Chris Girardi says we're trying to fill the airplane. We look at it like an airplane, and we can add these students at no cost. Now, I think we're going to go through this again, and we'll explain quickly. In much more detail, if you're interested, go back and watch episode 2 when we talk about MBTA communities. And where this stems from is that we had come up as part of Article 44 discussions, the town had claimed it only cost $4,500 to add students. Remember that. All right. We all know, and they've talked about it, it was even in the budget book, that per student cost in Shrewsbury is $17,700. All right. I'm going to make an argument here, is that if you look at two scenarios, that the concept that we can add students at no incremental cost is just not feasible. And we'll talk through that quick. Now, I'm not going to go through this, and I'm not going to explain where all this data comes from. This was from DESI, okay? We'll go a little fast. If you're interested in looking at this, pause the video, go into it in more detail. But if you look back in 2020, there was 6,258 students in Shrewsbury Public Schools, okay? We dropped from 2020 to 2022. We went down to 5,944. So we lost like 325 students, okay? Why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because when you look at it, we reduced by 325. That number is larger than 3 of our elementary schools. It's larger than Coolidge, it's larger than Patton, it's larger than Spring. So you would think if you eliminated an elementary school, your costs would go down, but that's not the case. Our expenditures actually increased by 8.8 million in that time frame. Now, people are going to say, well, there was COVID and there was COVID. Well, I don't know how our cost increased by 8.8 million. So in that time frame, it actually cost us $27,000 for every student we eliminated. So not only did it not cost nothing to add, it actually cost us money to get rid of. All right. So that's example 1. Example 2, okay? And this is a Shrewsbury Public Schools presentation. All right. If you're not aware, Massachusetts is a right to shelter state. So in certain, you have to house families with children. And in Shrewsbury, all right, there's an average of 48 students that we must put through our schools who are that are deemed homeless, right? If you look at the cost, we do get reimbursed in the state, but let's just be clear, that money is still coming out of our paychecks, right? So we pay state taxes. So just because it's not our property tax that goes to the school budget, we as taxpayers in Massachusetts, this is our money. Let's just be clear. State money is our money, local money is our money, federal money is our money. So with those 48 students, it cost, well, the state provided, I should say, $952,000. However, if you look at this, this is what was required from a resources standpoint from Shrewsbury Public Schools to handle 48 students, okay? So you look at the number of people and the number of costs, you actually go through this, and it turns out it cost us $20,700 per student for 48 students. So once again, how could we ever add students at 0 incremental cost? Maybe 1 student, all right? When we're talking about, I think where this stems from is, if we're going to add significant numbers of new housing units, there is no way this could be 0. Am I wrong?
You're not wrong.
Not wrong in the least. And if you look at the number of housing units that the town wants to add through MBTA Communities Act and just the building that's happening in town, and most of these units are family-friendly units, as that guideline, the law says, you're going to get a lot of families. Also, what that does, keep in mind that we don't have much control over those students coming into the Shrewsbury. The state generally can put them where they decide to put them. But if you have open housing, 1,500 units, say, they can put more of those students in. And the idea is, hey, it's a good idea. Everybody deserves an education. This is costing a lot of money. And what's happening is you're allowing more students to come in at an extremely high rate, regardless of whether they're the homeless students or just students. There's just a fallacy that you can bring on any student at no cost.
Right, and I think there's really no way to know what services each student needs.
Absolutely.
And you can see that a lot of the students that were coming in are not, they do require additional resources, whether it's, like I said, a lot of language, English is a second language. There's, if you look at it, bus monitors that are required, because when you add busing, depending on where these housing units might be, there could be on different bus routes. So there is a whole bunch of additional resources that are going to be required. So yeah, these students are $3,000, almost $4,000 more than, let's just say, the average Shrewsbury Public School student. So to get this number to 0, I mean, you have to have like the golden unicorn student, right? That it just moves in from another town, is already at or above performance when it comes to grade level, right? And is a model student, right? To even come close to getting that. So, I mean, maybe we're completely wrong. And I've always said, hey, if anybody from Shrewsbury Public Schools, right, or the school committee would like to come on and explain why our math is incorrect, or how we can actually educate additional students at $0, we'd be happy to have them on. So please contact us, right? Our email is below here. So we're happy to have you on.
So one thing I would add too is, back to that airplane analogy, it's not just about how much you spent for that ticket on the plane, right? I think about the whole extra leg room thing, right? If I don't spend the extra, I might end up in a small, uncomfortable seat. right? When we look at it in terms of students and their school experience, their upbringing here in Shrewsbury, if we keep adding more housing, adding more students, I think back to my older child who told me last year, I don't know anyone on my class list for 5th grade. And so those of you with kids will know in Shrewsbury in 5th grade, everyone comes together from our 5 elementary schools into Sherwood. And that broke my heart. I grew up in Westboro, one town over. I knew everybody in my class at that point. And so for him it was heartbreaking to hear, I don't know any of these kids. It was like, oh, maybe we've already gotten too big and we've kind of passed that point. But that's where I think it's important that we maybe take a pause as a community and think about the ramifications. If we do allow an extra 1,500 apartment units to go up at Christmas Tree Shop Plaza, what does that mean just from a non-financial cost perspective, right? The cost of the upbringing of our kids here in town. Right?
Yeah. And I think on the capacity piece, I think when you look at it, because I looked at the capacity, I think in the elementary level, right, if you look at what the buildings can house, I think we're okay. However, keep in mind, when we're looking at that, we're looking at schools that we already are using modular classrooms that we bolted onto schools, right, to get them to a certain point. And that's only the elementary level. We're over capacity in Oak, we're over capacity in Sherwood, and we're over capacity at the high school. And I think I put the numbers here. Oak, we're at 105% of capacity. Sherwood, we're at 102. And at the high school, we're at 127% of capacity. So even if the elementary schools by themselves, right, can support the sizes and those additional students, they all are funneling, to your point, into a choke point when you start at the middle school and the high school level, which at some point in time we have to address, right?
I think it goes back to that checklist that we showed in the last episode, which is basically ask the questions, because there's consequences to questions when you don't think long term.
Yeah.
And the consequence is allowing this kind of building consistently in the town. You're not thinking about the future, and suddenly you have a giant bill that we are going to pay.
Now, speaking of long-term consequences, okay, let's transition to Article 32, okay? Now, Article 32 was a citizen's petition, which is by citizen's petition. It says by petition there, and that is to rezone a parcel of land, Holden Street and Clinton Street, and actually revert it back to what it was. It was zoned as commercial property. It was back in 2020, as part of town meeting, a developer, right? This is a bone I have to pick. A developer came to the select board, to the town, and said, I would like to change the zoning of this parcel of land to limited industrial. Now, when they do that, and when a developer brings a warrant article, it does not say brought by developer. It just says article. So from a town meeting member who isn't engaged or isn't attending pre-town meeting or may not know, it looks like, oh, this must have been from the town. But if you're a citizen and you say, hey, I think I have a good idea, I want to change something, well, it's blatantly obvious that it says, hey, it's by petition. This is not normal. So, it's kind of like that, the flashing red lights, buyer beware, caution, warning. So what I wanted to dig into, I'm going to go back, right? We're going to look at what was actually talked about at town meeting in 2020, because it came up where people said, we voted on this twice. Well, I want to go back to 2020 because it was a unique situation. It was COVID, limited number of people. So let's go back and listen to the attorney for the developer explain what this petition was all about.
160 Holden Street, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of GFI Partners, acquired this property in late January and has moved forward to try to consolidate the Worcester Sand and Gravel, now known as Worcester Sand and Stone operation. COVID has certainly impacted our review of the site. We met very early with the town, and this is really the first step in coming up with a full-blown master plan for the site, for the consolidation of the Worcester Sand and Stone operation, and determining the best means of use. So if this is allowed by this town meeting, we'll move to the next step. We'll do further diligence on the site as far as testing of geotech conditions, soil conditions, wetland conditions, develop a master plan, work closely with the town manager's office and the planning department, and then start to incorporate that into the myriad of reviews that are required, as Ms. Loss indicated, both at the town level and at the state level.
Okay, so if you listen to that, it was clear that essentially said, hey, we just bought this parcel in January. We're not sure exactly what it's going to become, but we're going to work with the town and put together a plan if this moves forward. No indication of what the use would be. Now, in other parts and other meetings before that, there was a list of things that could be done, but I'm not sure how many people looked at that. When you were at town meeting outside at Oak in the middle of August, I'm not sure you could make the best decision on what was coming up. The thing I wanted to show is, the reason I wanted to bring this up is, if you look at what the proposed project is, and this is where it goes back to Brian, the think, and Carolyn, right? We're talking about 16 football fields here, right? 2 industrial warehouses that are completely going to change what the terrain is right off 290 in that part of town. So you're completely dramatically changing what that neighborhood looks like for those residents. And I understand why they may be upset by this. Fair?
Fair enough.
Yeah. I mean, just imagine if I lived in that neighborhood. You saw me get upset about Article 44. I would be really upset about this. Just the footprint of these buildings alone is disturbing to me. I feel badly for the people that live in this neighborhood. I feel bad for our entire community because this is over our town aquifer and one of our main water sources in town. And, you know, I went to the hearing that they had, I think it was with Finance Committee or maybe it was with the Planning Board, you know, and they tried to tell us that they would put in some rain gardens and it will make the water even more pure than it would be otherwise. And I'm like, you know, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And I just, again, I come back to the kids and the experience here in town and I'm like, gosh, anyone that has kids that play Little League, you know there's not enough parking at Dean Park. Like for a baseball game, you literally, you have to circle. You can barely find enough parking spots. I'm like, this would have been a lovely place to put a park. But no, it's, you know, well, we don't have control over it. It's a private real estate transaction. It's just zoning and, you know, we're going to put up R&D and biotech labs, but that just never seems to be the case. We got another one of these right near where we are on Walnut, the 2 Centec buildings. And again, kind of got pushed through during COVID and I was oblivious to it. And, you know, now my kids will face those repercussions of polluted air.
I think the issue is the town, I guess the town fathers and the politicians, they convince folks that it's better to have commercial tax benefits, right? And I don't necessarily disagree with smart commercial building allowing for a better tax base. The thing that bugged me about this most was the citizens petition was really town meeting members. If you look again at that checklist, one of the things was looking out for the individual and the minority. What it means, and it said it's because of the United States being a republic. What it means in that statement is the rights of the minority are incredibly important. And the folks that live in this neighborhood are getting railroaded a bit by this development. And I feel bad because I think the town meeting members, to be quite frank, let them down. I think it's a situation where I don't live there. So it's okay for me. It's tax revenue for commercial base, rather than looking at that one thing that says, wait a minute, what did these people think? How did these people fail? Right? And they are incredibly impacted. Forget about the aquifer and everything else. It's a matter of a giant development with massive amount of trucks going up and down Route 70. You would not want to live in one of those little houses that's next to that building.
No. And the other thing I want to tie into this is when you look at how this went down, there was a weird amendment that was thrown in by a town meeting member who happened to be on the list, who hasn't been there in a while. And it was about, hey, we're going to change this to residential. And it really, I think, confused the whole process. But the one thing I want to highlight, we have 2 clips we're going to show, is I think the perception of certain town meeting members as to what the role is, and I think how we kind of disagree. All right, so we're going to kind of listen to these 2 comments. The first one is going to be about, you know, essentially what authority do we need to ask permission effectively? And then the second one about, hey, listening to the town leaders. So let's go take a look at both of these back to back.
Patrick Pitney, Precinct 5. Mr. Moderator, in order to consider this amendment, would we need a recommendation from 1, the Finance Committee, and 2, the Planning Board?
You can do it. It's nice to have those, but you don't need them.
Okay.
They've had as much time as anybody else.
All right.
The people that will be building have to follow all of the laws, aquifer protection, what the planning board puts in place, And they've done everything they can to do this right for us. And we're going to mess it up if we start voting for all these other things just because it's 10:30 at night and we want to go home. We need to do this right. So either we stop talking about it tonight and put it for another time, or we just vote this down. Listen to the town manager and listen to Mr. Samia, because they're telling you the accurate information.
A lot to dissect there.
Yeah.
So my belief, I think what we talked about is the town meeting member is the legislative body. They are the one who can make a decision. We don't need to defer to a higher power, whether it's the planning board or the finance committee, to essentially say, what should we do? And I'll just vote that way. That's not why we have town meeting. The town meeting is there so that we individually can have 240 people make that decision, right? And secondly, the second statement by Donald O'Connor was, hey, listen to Mr. Samia, listen to Mr. Mizikar, they're giving you the right information. Well, maybe they are, but is it the complete information? Do you fully understand all the ramifications behind it? Or have you just listened to Finance Committee recommends 9-0, 5-0. I mean, Planning Board is 7-0. That's the part that I think we just are asking people, if you're a town meeting member, do a little bit more homework and make sure you're sure.
Yeah,
Fair?
I mean, I think for me, the thing that's most concerning is it always seems that these are unanimous. Finance committee, select board, it's always unanimous. And to me, that doesn't seem healthy. That to me shows that, either A, enough questions are not being asked during those meetings, or there's things being discussed behind closed doors that we're just not privy to, and they're, somehow coming to agreement unanimously. But it just, to me, doesn't feel right. I don't think they should always be unanimous. It, to me, indicates there may be, I don't know, just a bigger problem at hand, right?
Right.
I felt there was just so much short-sightedness with those two clips, right? These are folks that I think a couple of them had been on the finance committee or had been involved in town politics.
Select board
certainly.
member.
Yeah. So they should know better. And I think the idea that I should listen to people on the stage because they are smarter and know more than me completely misses the point of being a town meeting member. A town meeting member, to be quite frank, should be actually they should question everything, right? Mm-hmm. We should actually dig into it and learn and understand. You are the legislative body. You are not here to take advice. You can listen, but understand that everybody has a motivation.
Absolutely.
And because of that, it's not them who make that decision for you. It's you that make the decision for them. And that's just lost on so many people in that room.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We could spend a lot of time on Article 32, but we've got to move. We're going to move on. Now, there was one interesting vote, right? If you looked at across the board, I think there was only one vote that went against recommendation, and that was Article 42 on digital signage, for all things. So that was actually a standing vote, and we're actually going to go to a clip showing the actual reading of that vote.
On this matter, 113 in the affirmative, 58 in the negative. It does not achieve 2/3. We will now move on to the next article.
Okay, as we saw, it was a 113 to 58. If there was 114 votes, it passes. 113, it fails. The one thing I wanted to talk about, which I think is interesting, and I don't know what you thought about how they actually tally votes in this day and age. The things that I guess are a little concerning, if we go back to other things we talked about in the previous episode, was there's no record of how town meeting members vote or attend. We do not post attendance on the website, and you have no record of how any individual town meeting member voted on an issue, right?
Correct.
So there was actually a committee that was formed in 2019, all right? If you didn't know, it was about electronic voting, and it was a study committee. And what they talked about was, hey, the primary focus would be for accountability to voters, right? To me, that's it. That's the pinnacle, like end stop, we're done. This is why we're going to do it, accountability to voters. So we not only have accurate count of the vote quickly, but you could go back and say, does these town meeting members share my beliefs, right? And what ended up happening was, right, they determined at that time that, of course, because of our budget constraints, we can spend $86+ million in schools, but we can't find $20,000 or what, I think it was something around that, I might be wrong, for a voting system that allows us to have accountability to our elected leaders.
Yeah. And what's crazy is a town meeting member, just like you said, I don't know how they voted. So they're on the ballot. I can ask, Caroline, how did you vote on 44? I happen to be there. But other than that, I can't find out. So what am I actually voting on for these people? To your point, looking again at those checklists, do they share my same values, my beliefs? Are they, super pro-tax people that I'm not necessarily for? I should know that.
Absolutely. And you should know if they show up.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't have to dig and, make requests. They should just post this information so you can go and make the best decision at the ballot box the next time we actually need to vote.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, that's that one. So that was 42, the only one that did not pass. Now, lastly, on to Article 44. Now, this was a lot less contentious than I think it would have been. This would have been a lot of time on MBTA, but since the recommendation was to move it to the fall, not a lot of debate. But one thing I want to touch upon was the statement that was made by Kevin Mizikar, our town manager, and we're going to go to that video. Because what he actually ends up saying here is how we should be treating this in the fall. So we're going to go to that clip.
Finally, and perhaps the point that I want to stress the most, to effectively use our time prior to town meeting. Although the merits of the state mandate are important and we welcome this discussion, ultimately, town meeting will be voting in the fall on our local proposal, not the mandate itself. We find the merits of our local proposal to be the critical discussion piece, and we hope to focus on this, our local proposal, between now and the fall town meeting in order to present it to this body for your consideration.
The biggest proponent contention, which I want to talk about, is that in that statement, he's saying that we're only voting on the local proposal, not the state mandate. And that's why I want to go right back to this checklist, right? Because I totally disagree with that mindset. You cannot ask people to separate something like that. And you're actually telling them that they shouldn't when you look at this voter checklist, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So if you look at it here, what does it cost ultimately? If I went down this thing, I would say MBTA, is it necessary? No. Is anybody in Shrewsbury asking for it? No. Can we afford it? No. What will it cost ultimately? A lot. How will it affect basic liberties? Well, we're changing zoning for another, for a higher power that we didn't really want to agree to. Is it in best interest of everybody? No. Is it a foot in the door? Absolutely. Does it place too much power in an individual or group? Yes, the Attorney General in the state, it does. Does it recognize the individual? No. Is it? I can just keep going, right? Yeah. So if you can answer no to those, that state mandate says we should have to do it, absolutely should be part of it, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think about what is this about, right? Yeah. I'm all for building housing I want everyone to have a home. I don't want to come across like the Wicked Witch of the West. I want everyone to have a home. I don't like that the state of Massachusetts is telling us how many apartments to build in town, and I don't like that it's being positioned, well, it's just zoning. Just because we zone, it doesn't mean there will be building. And I'm like, but if you build it, they will come. So if you zone it, they will build. And I think repeatedly what we have seen is real estate developers in the state of Massachusetts are hungry. And just because you have the room to develop somewhere doesn't mean you should. And it goes all back to that checklist. Yeah, just because there may be ample space to put apartments there, it doesn't mean that we should. And I think more people need to be asking those questions.
Yeah. So the last thing I want to touch upon, we'll talk a lot more about this as we get closer to October. But in the last time we have here, one of the things you did actually is part of debate on 44 was you thought it was important to stand up, and you brought up 2 potential conflicts of interest.
I did.
Why did you feel that was so important? And actually, what did you bring up?
So this is one where I felt like it was my civic duty, right? For people that are watching that weren't aware of this, so our town moderator is married to one of our state representatives, and he basically is, I don't want to say in charge of town meeting, but he kind of is the one that determines what gets debated for how long and can kind of shut things down. And I had asked, given the fact that his wife had voted for the MBTA Communities Act and voted for it to go into law, did he feel that he should recuse himself and appoint a temporary moderator for that question when it's discussed in the fall? Because I felt that, even if there isn't legally a conflict of interest, there is an appearance of one. And I felt it was perfectly reasonable to ask, would you be willing to recuse yourself? And the response I got was, of course not, which I found a little strange, but that's kind of besides the point. We can table that. The other thing that was concerning to me in my research was that the town council for Shrewsbury actually at one point did represent GFI, which is one of the large real estate developers that's been working in town. And that wasn't to call him out. I've heard he's a very nice gentleman. I've never had the opportunity to work with him, but I just felt it was worth noting because, again, I think for a lot of people in the room at town meeting, they sort of assume that those people up on the stage always have everyone's best interests at heart and everyone's always unanimous. So of course they must be recommending things that are good for us. And I'm like, well, but what's the harm in asking the question? What's the harm in making it, out there in the open? I mean, that's not to say there are conflicts, but there could be an appearance. So if there's an appearance of it, why don't we address that?
Because we do it, like in the planning board, back to GFI. I mean, GFI is building another property on Route 20. There's another, say, warehouse, which is not, it's more of a manufacturing facility / headquarters that they're building. And, on the planning board, Steve Rodolikis is in the law firm with Mr. Donahue, who's in the video we saw, who represents GFI. So there are connection points. And to your point, you're not saying that I know unequivocally that there's this big conflict. It's just when in doubt, right, just make people aware. And then when you do so, I think people will say, okay, well, thank you for letting me know.
Right.
But when you don't necessarily aren't as forthcoming about, well, why are you stepping out? What is this related to? I think people start to question things, right? And I think that's what you're
To
really
be
getting.
offended that you're asked it, to me, gosh, I don't know that it made me feel much better, but
I think openness and transparency need to happen in a representative republic and certainly in a town. And I think it's fair to ask, can you step aside for this particular
just for this
vote?
one article.
Right.
And for the attorney, you did represent this company. There's nothing wrong with you representing us today, but there's an appearance here. Maybe you should step aside just for this specific issue. Makes me feel more comfortable.
Yeah. Well, Caroline, I know we were running out of time here, but I tell you, there was so much good feedback at town meeting. A lot of town meeting members said, oh, I just love her. I'm so glad she was asking all these questions. So keep asking your questions at town meeting, and hopefully we can get more town meeting members who are engaged as you were. So I really appreciate you taking the time today to be with us here on the Unselects. And I thank everybody for watching, and we'll be back again with another episode of the Unselects. And I'm Gregg Richards.
I'm Brian Costello.
And I'm Caroline Maycumber, Precinct 9.
And we are the Unselects. Thank you very much.